I've always considered myself a simple man. Not simple-minded, just uncomplicated. I enjoy my routine, my work as a general contractor, and the evenings spent with my wife, Emily, in our quiet little home in suburban Ohio. Life isn't glamorous, but it's steady, and I've always been grateful for that. Until a few weeks ago, I'd have said my marriage was rock solid. Now, I'm not so sure. It started with small things. Emily, who used to share every little detail about her day, began to grow distant. When I asked how work was going, her responses were short, clipped. Busy, she'd say, or fine. She started coming home later than usual, blaming last-minute meetings or lingering projects. I wanted to believe her, I really did. But there was something different in her voice, a guardedness that made my gut churn. Then there was her phone. Emily was never one to guard her phone before. It usually sat on the kitchen counter or coffee table, free for anyone to see. But now, it was glued to her side. She'd get a text, glance at the screen, and smile faintly, then flip it face down on the table like it was some kind of secret. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Work could genuinely be hectic, and maybe the phone thing was nothing more than a new habit. But doubts have a way of creeping in, little cracks in the walls of trust that grow wider the longer you look at them. And I started looking. The tipping point came on a Thursday evening. Emily was running late again, and I decided to surprise her by ordering takeout from her favorite Thai place. When she finally walked through the door, there was something in her demeanor that stopped me cold. She wasn't harried or tired like she claimed to be. She looked happy. Flushed, even, like she'd just come from something wonderful. "Long day?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Yeah," she replied, avoiding my eyes. "Thanks for dinner." She kissed me on the cheek, a brief, distracted peck, and disappeared into the bedroom. Later that night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. Emily's behavior didn't fit with the woman I'd known for 10 years. The woman who laughed at my dumb jokes, who couldn't resist singing loudly to 80s power ballads on road trips. Something had changed. The question was, what? And why? The next morning, I was still stewing over the change in Emily. I'd barely slept, and it felt like the unanswered questions were burning a hole in my chest. But I was determined to stay rational. Maybe I was overthinking things, making a mountain out of a molehill. I decided to keep my eyes open and my mouth shut, at least for now. That resolve lasted all of 2 days. On Saturday morning, while I was working in the garage, I heard the doorbell ring. I glanced up from under the hood of my truck to see a guy in a delivery uniform standing on the porch. He wasn't much older than me, mid-30s maybe, with the build of someone who probably hit the gym regularly. From where I stood, he seemed unusually cheerful for someone working on a weekend. Emily opened the door, and their interaction was peculiar. I couldn't hear every word, but her voice had a softness, an almost playful tone, that she didn't seem to use with me anymore. The courier handed her a small package, and they exchanged a few more words. Then, to my growing irritation, Emily laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a real, genuine laugh. I stepped closer, still hidden by the garage wall, watching as Emily lingered in the doorway even after the guy turned to leave. She stood there, watching him walk back to his truck, before finally closing the door. My stomach churned. That evening, I decided to casually bring it up. "Who was at the door this morning?" I asked, keeping my tone as light as I could manage. "Oh, just a delivery guy," she replied, not looking up from the cutting board where she was chopping vegetables for dinner. "Seemed like a long chat for just a delivery," I said, trying to sound offhand. She paused, knife in midair, and gave me a sharp look. "Are you keeping tabs on me now, Luke?" she asked, her voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "No, I was just..." "Because it feels like you're interrogating me." She slammed the knife down, her hands trembling slightly. "He was just being friendly. That's all." "Is that a crime now?" Her reaction caught me off guard. It was too defensive, too angry. I backed off, mumbling an apology, but her outburst only deepened my suspicions. Why was she so quick to lash out? What was she hiding? Over the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about the courier. The way Emily had laughed with him, the ease in her posture that I hadn't seen in months. I started watching for the guy, looking out the window every time I heard a truck in the neighborhood. And then, one afternoon, I saw him again. This time, I was ready. I grabbed my toolbox and walked out to the driveway, pretending to rummage around, just close enough to overhear their conversation. But to my surprise, it was nothing remarkable. The guy handed her a package, said something about the weather, and left. No lingering, no laughing. Just, normal. That should have been the end of it, but the unease didn't go away. If the courier wasn't the issue, then what was? Who or what was making Emily so distant? I didn't know it then, but I was barking up the wrong tree. And the real problem was much closer to home than I realized. The truth began unraveling on a Monday evening. Emily had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache. I was in the living room, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, when her laptop, left open on the coffee table, pinged with a notification. It wasn't something I would usually think twice about, but the sender's name caught my attention, Greg. Greg wasn't a name I recognized. We shared most of our social circles, and if Greg had been a coworker or a friend, I was sure I'd have heard of him. Something in my gut told me to look closer. I hesitated, debating whether I was crossing a line. But curiosity, or maybe something darker, got the better of me. I tapped the touchpad, and the message opened. It was nothing scandalous at first glance. Thanks for listening today. You always know just what to say. It could have been innocent. It should have been innocent. But paired with Emily's recent behavior, it felt like a crack in the dam. My heart pounded as I navigated to their chat history. At first, their messages seemed work-related, discussions about deadlines, projects, and office gossip. But the tone began shifting, growing more personal with each scroll. Greg was funny, charming even, dropping inside jokes and compliments that went just a bit beyond professional. And Emily was responding in kind. She shared stories from her childhood, complained about her long days, and even made comments about how Greg always made her laugh. It wasn't physical, at least not from what I saw. But there was an intimacy in their messages that left me reeling. This wasn't just a coworker. Greg had found his way into parts of Emily that I thought belonged to me. I closed the laptop and sat there in silence, my mind a chaotic storm. Was I overreacting? Emotional affairs, if that's even what this was, weren't the same as physical betrayal. Or were they? Either way, it didn't feel right. It didn't feel fair. The next morning, I couldn't hide my unease. Emily noticed right away. You okay? She asked as I shoved my breakfast around my plate. Yeah, I said quickly. Too quickly. She frowned but didn't press. And I didn't volunteer. That day, I called an old friend, Charlie, who used to work in IT. I told him I needed help accessing deleted data work-related. I lied. He walked me through what to do and, with his guidance, I uncovered something worse than I could have imagined. Greg wasn't just a coworker. He was her team lead. A man who, judging by some of the emails I'd found, had a reputation for manipulating and charming his way into people's good graces, and sometimes their lives. He had a way of making his underlings feel indispensable while subtly undermining their confidence, ensuring their loyalty and dependence. The messages painted a picture of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Greg wasn't just a flirt, he was deliberate, calculating, and good at reading vulnerabilities. And Emily, my Emily, had fallen into his web. I wanted to confront her right away, but something stopped me. Maybe it was fear of what she'd say, of what it would mean for us. Instead, I decided to dig deeper, to understand the full extent of what I was dealing with before I acted. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized this wasn't just about Greg. This was about us, about what had gone wrong in our marriage that made Emily seek connection elsewhere. And as much as I hated to admit it, I knew I had to face that truth, too. I spent the next few days walking around in a fog, trying to make sense of everything. My mind was a storm of questions I couldn't answer. Was Emily unhappy with me? Did she even realize how much she was leaning on Greg? And, most importantly, was it too late to fix things? My opportunity to confront the situation came sooner than I expected, but not with Emily, at least not at first. On a Friday afternoon, I saw the courier again. He was delivering another package, and this time, I decided to intercept him. Hey, I said, stepping onto the porch as he turned to leave. Can I ask you something? He looked up, startled but polite. Sure, man. What's up? I hesitated, unsure of how to word it without sounding unhinged. You seem to stop by here a lot. My wife says you're just delivering packages, but I don't know. Do you talk to her much? His expression shifted, confusion mixing with something like offense. Not really. I mean, just small talk. You know, the weather, delivery stuff. Is there a problem? I felt a flush of embarrassment creeping up my neck. No problem, I muttered. Sorry to bother you. He shrugged and walked off, leaving me feeling like an idiot. I'd let my suspicions about him spiral out of control, only to find out there was nothing to them. But instead of relief, I felt worse. The courier wasn't the issue, which meant my focus was now squarely back on Greg and on Emily. That evening, I decided I couldn't put off the confrontation any longer. When Emily came home, I asked her to sit down. She looked wary but complied, her eyes searching mine for clues. What's going on, Luke? She asked, her voice cautious. I took a deep breath. I know about Greg, I said, trying to keep my tone even. Her face froze for a split second before she masked it with confusion. What about Greg? Don't, I said, sharper than I intended. Don't play dumb, Emily. I've seen the messages. She stared at me, her eyes widening. You went through my laptop? That's not the point, I snapped. The point is you've been confiding in him. Sharing things you don't even tell me anymore. It's not what you think, she said quickly, her voice trembling. Greg's he's easy to talk to, okay? He listens. That's all. That's all? I echoed bitterly. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're leaning on him for things you used to get from me. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But instead, she sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. You're right, she admitted softly. I've been distant. I don't know. Lonely. Lonely? I repeated, my voice breaking. You're the one who's been pulling away. And you didn't even notice, she shot back, anger flaring in her voice now. You're so wrapped up in your work, in your routines, that you barely even see me anymore. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to deny it, to tell her she was wrong, but deep down, I knew she wasn't. Somewhere along the way, I'd taken her for granted, assuming our marriage would run on autopilot while I focused on everything else. And in that void, Greg had stepped in. For a long moment, we sat there in silence, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. Finally, I asked, did anything physical happen? No, she said firmly, meeting my eyes. It wasn't like that. I swear. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But trust, once cracked, doesn't mend easily. And as much as I hated it, I knew this conversation was just the beginning. There was a lot we needed to unpack, a lot I wasn't sure we could fix. But if there was one thing I was certain of, it was that I wasn't ready to give up, not yet. The next morning, Emily left early, saying she needed to clear her head. I told her to take her time, but I didn't say the same for myself. The truth was, I had no intention of sitting idle. Something about Greg still didn't sit right with me, and I wanted to know more. I called Charlie again, asking for help accessing deeper records. He hesitated at first. You're getting into some murky waters, Luke, he warned. But when I told him it was about protecting my marriage, he relented. Just don't do anything stupid, he added. By the afternoon, I had a folder of information on Greg, a man who looked perfect on the surface but cracked the more you probed. He'd bounced around jobs, always in positions of authority, but never stayed anywhere long. His departures were often shrouded in vague explanations, creative differences, or pursuing other opportunities. It all seemed harmless enough until I found a lawsuit buried in public records. A former co-worker had accused Greg of harassment. The case had been settled out of court, but the allegations painted a picture of someone who blurred boundaries and exploited trust. My stomach twisted as I read the details. The way he manipulated women's emotions, how he slowly eroded their confidence while making them dependent on his approval, it was all too familiar. I didn't want to believe Emily had fallen into his trap, but the signs were there. And now I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't just about emotional connection. If Greg was as manipulative as these records suggested, what else was he capable of? That evening, I asked Emily to talk again. She hesitated, her movements slow and cautious, like she was bracing for another fight. "What is it now?" she asked, crossing her arms defensively. I held up the folder. "This," I said, placing it on the table between us. "It's about Greg." Her eyes flicked to the folder, then back to me. "What did you do, Luke?" "I found out who he really is," I said, my voice firm. "He's not just your coworker, Emily. He's a predator." Her face paled, but she didn't speak. I opened the folder, showing her the lawsuit, the pattern of behavior. "This isn't about me being jealous," I continued. "It's about protecting you. Do you see what kind of man he is?" Emily stared at the documents, her expression a mix of disbelief and horror. I didn't know," she whispered. He never did anything like that to me." "But he could have," I said, leaning forward. "You've been giving him pieces of yourself, Emily. Pieces that should have stayed between us. Don't you see how dangerous that is?" Tears welled in her eyes, and she nodded slowly. "I feel so stupid," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I thought he was just being kind. I didn't realize." "It's not your fault," I said quickly, softening my tone. "This is what he does. He finds vulnerabilities and exploits them. But you need to cut him off, Emily. Completely." She nodded again, wiping her eyes. "You're right. I'll talk to HR tomorrow. I'll ask to be reassigned or quit if I have to." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, and the damage Greg had done wasn't just to Emily, it was to us. Still, her willingness to act gave me hope. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we might have a fighting chance. The next morning, Emily stayed true to her word. She called HR and explained that she could no longer work under Greg's supervision. She didn't mention the lawsuit or his manipulations, only citing personal reasons for requesting a transfer. They agreed to move her to another department while they reviewed her concerns. It was a small step, but it felt like progress. That evening, we sat down together in the living room, the tension between us softer but still present. For the first time in a while, Emily spoke freely. "I didn't realize how far I'd let things go," she admitted, her voice quiet. "At first, it was harmless. He was just someone to talk to, someone who listened. But somewhere along the way, I started. I don't know. I started needing that." I nodded, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Why didn't you tell me you felt that way?" She hesitated, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "Because I didn't think you'd care. Luke, you've been so distant lately. You're always focused on work or fixing something around the house. It's like you've stopped seeing me." Her words stung because they were true. I'd gotten so comfortable in our routine that I hadn't noticed her slipping away. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I'm sorry, Emily. I didn't mean to make you feel invisible. I guess I thought we were okay." "So did I," she said, a small, sad smile crossing her face. "But somewhere along the way, I started feeling alone. And instead of telling you, I turned to someone else. That's on me." For a moment, the weight of our mistakes hung between us, heavy and suffocating. But then Emily reached across the space between us, her hand finding mine. "I don't want to lose what we have, Luke," she said, her voice trembling. "I want to fix this. I want to fix us." I squeezed her hand, the warmth of her touch grounding me. "Me too," I said. "But it's going to take work. For both of us." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know. I'm ready." That night, we sat for hours, talking like we hadn't in years. We laid everything bare, our frustrations, our fears, our hopes. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the honesty hurt, when I wanted to walk away just to escape the discomfort. But we stayed, confronting the cracks in our foundation and agreeing to rebuild together. By the time we went to bed, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: hope. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a start. The days that followed were slow, tentative steps toward healing. Emily started leaving her phone on the counter again, a quiet gesture of transparency that didn't go unnoticed. I made an effort to come home earlier from work, even if it meant pushing deadlines. We reintroduced small rituals, like morning coffee together and evening walks, trying to rekindle the connection that had once come so naturally. But trust is fragile, and rebuilding it was harder than either of us anticipated. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Emily hesitated before speaking. "Luke, there's something I need to tell you." My chest tightened. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, her hands clutching the edge of the sink. "I saw Greg at the office today. He came by my desk, asking why I was avoiding him. I told him I'd been transferred, but he wouldn't let it go. He said he didn't understand why things had changed between us." "What did you say?" I asked, my voice carefully measured. "I told him it was none of his business," she replied quickly. "And then I walked away. But I wanted you to know, in case you hear about it or if he tries something." Hearing Greg's name again made my stomach churn, but I appreciated her honesty. "Thank you for telling me," I said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I know that wasn't easy." She turned to me, her eyes filled with both guilt and determination. "I'm trying, Luke. I know I messed up, but I'm trying to make it right." "I know you are," I said, though the knot in my stomach remained. The truth was, Greg wasn't the only obstacle we faced. There were moments when I caught myself questioning Emily's every move, moments when I wanted to check her phone or ask probing questions just to ease my own insecurities. But I resisted. I knew that if I let those doubts control me, they would destroy the fragile progress we were making. Instead, I focused on forgiving not just Emily, but myself, too. I had failed her in ways I hadn't realized until it was almost too late. I'd let complacency take the place of connection, assuming that what we had didn't need tending. But love, I was learning, needed care. It needed effort. One night, as we lay in bed, Emily reached for my hand. "Do you think we'll be okay?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I stared at the ceiling, thinking about everything we'd been through. "I think it's going to take time," I admitted. "But I also think we're worth it." She squeezed my hand, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I think so too." It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was honest. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough weeks turned into months, and slowly, life began to find a new rhythm. The wounds between Emily and me hadn't disappeared, but they were healing, bit by bit, like cracks in the pavement slowly filled by time and care. The trust we had once taken for granted was being rebuilt not through grand gestures, but in the small, everyday moments that made up our lives. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emily turned to me. "Do you remember our first year in this house?" she asked, her voice soft. I smiled, the memory tugging at the corners of my mind. "Yeah. You were obsessed with planting that garden out back." She laughed, the sound light and free. "I was so proud of those tomatoes. Even though they were half the size they were supposed to be." "They were delicious, though," I said, grinning. "Especially when you made that pasta sauce." Her smile faltered for a moment, and she reached for my hand. "I miss those days," she said quietly. "When everything felt simple." I squeezed her hand, the warmth of her touch anchoring me. "We can have that again," I said. "It'll take work, but I think we're getting there." She nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "I want that, Luke. More than anything." In the months that followed, we made a conscious effort to nurture our relationship. We sought out new ways to connect, cooking together, hiking trails we'd never explored, even trying ballroom dancing, though neither of us was particularly graceful. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments when the past threatened to resurface, but we faced those challenges together. Emily also followed through with her decision to leave Greg's influence behind. She accepted a position in a different company, one that allowed her to work from home a few days a week. The change seemed to lift a weight off her shoulders, and I could see the Emily I'd fallen in love with returning, stronger, more vibrant, and more determined than ever. As for me, I realized that rebuilding trust wasn't just about forgiving Emily, it was about forgiving myself for the ways I'd failed her. I started showing up, not just physically, but emotionally. I made it a point to listen, to notice the little things, to remind her every day that she was seen and valued. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, Emily raised her glass. "To us," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "For getting through the hard stuff and coming out stronger." I lifted my glass, a lump forming in my throat. "To us," I echoed. The clink of our glasses felt like a quiet victory, a reminder that love, even when bruised, could endure. It was a victory not over each other, but over the doubts, fears, and mistakes that had once threatened to pull us apart. As we cleared the table and settled into the comfort of our evening, I glanced at Emily and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. It wasn't the naive certainty of our early years or the complacent security I'd once mistaken for stability. It was something deeper, a quiet confidence that, despite everything, we were still choosing each other. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And for the first time in a long time, that felt more than enough.